Good evening and a warm welcome to this lecture tonight. Friends, the Ashtavakra Gita is a non-dual classical text composed in the Sanskrit language, which gives the highest teachings of the yoga of self-knowledge. These teachings concern the goal of yoga, enlightenment or self-realization. The text is set in the form of a discourse between a teacher who knows the highest truth in his own direct experience, and the pupil who seeks to know it. And the teacher is the sage called Ashtavakra. The pupil is a king named Janak. Janak has heard that there is a higher knowledge that brings lasting fulfillment. He also knows that it differs from intellectual knowledge and cannot be adequately conveyed by words. The inexpressible nature of the higher knowledge is suggested in the following verse. Knowledge of the imperishable essence makes a worldly, active and eloquent man inactive, silent and wise. If words cannot express ultimate reality, how can they help us in our quest for higher knowledge? Friends, they can provide some degree of guidance. They provide us with some degree of guidance. The teachings of those who are established in the higher knowledge have a special quality. They appeal to what is highest in us. If we are receptive, our latent capacity for an illumined understanding will stir into life. Though the Ashtavakra Gita is presented as a discourse between teacher and pupil, as we've heard, King Janak doesn't play a big part as a pupil, nor does he remain a pupil for long. He only asks 3 questions throughout the whole text, and these questions are put in the opening verse. The answers given by the sage take up the rest of the first chapter. When we meet Janak again at the start of the second chapter, he speaks, but he no longer asks questions. He appears as one who has fully grasped the inner meaning of the teachings he was given. Now he expresses himself as an enlightened sage. What then were the questions Janak asked? O Lord, tell me this. How does one acquire knowledge of truth? And how liberation? And how the practice of renunciation? Here, knowledge of truth and liberation are essentially the same thing. They are both terms indicating direct experience of ultimate reality. This experience is one of knowing, but not the transient knowing of passing objects. It is to know completely the true nature of the knowledge principle in our own being. What this realization reveals is indicated in the following verse from chapter 1. Thou art that consciousness, the supreme bliss, in which the world is imagined. Be happy, that thou art. The implication is that in our true nature, we're not different from the Absolute. As King Janak will say in chapter 2, wonderful am I, in spite of the body and its properties. I'm one, I go nowhere, I come from nowhere, I abide in myself, pervading the whole universe. Thus, liberation in the non-dual tradition is inseparable from self-knowledge, knowing ourselves to be beyond the limitations of personality, is pure consciousness, infinite and eternal. But let us, so to speak, re-enter the realm of relativity to ensure that our approach to this self-awakening is correct and traditional. King Janak knows there is a price for this knowledge, a price that is not easily paid. And this comes in his last question. How does one acquire the knowledge, or how does one acquire the practice of renunciation? Does it require him to give up all or part of his great wealth? Should he renounce his kingship and become a wandering monk? In the society of that time, there were many who opted to become homeless monks and ascetics, who perhaps wore a special kind of robe, who had apparently given up everything. There were even formal rules for living such a life. At first sight, then, the meaning of renunciation and what you had to renounce seems obvious. But Janak had the insight to know that there was a deeper renunciation, which was not the same as physical renunciation. Something deeper and more intimate had to be renounced if one was to realize the supreme truth. It was said earlier that in the non-dual teachings, liberation is inseparable from self-knowledge. When we try to determine what we really are, our ideas usually center on what our personality has become. We may find ourselves rooted in feelings to do with our age, our nationality, or religion. It could be our work, our appearance, our successes, and perhaps our imagined failures, and so on, almost without end. These ideas amount to a view of ourselves as limited, finite, mortal, and subject to suffering. But King Janak already knows that a deeper self-knowledge exists, and he is willing to release his hold on this present self-image and open himself to the influence of a new and higher force. But he is not sure how to bring about this deeper renunciation. So he wants and he needs to know exactly what it means and how to achieve it. Therefore, he asks, how does one acquire the practice of renunciation? In responding, the sage Ashtavakra does not make a special issue of renunciation. Instead, he widens the concept by fusing it with Janak's other questions. How does one acquire knowledge of truth? And how liberation? After first commending the great virtues of contentment, simplicity of life, forgiveness, compassion, truth speaking, and control of the senses, he straightway proceeds to enlighten Janak with the highest teachings, that the true self is not the body, not the mind, nor the ego, but a principle of pure intelligence, pure bliss, and the natural state of the soul. Any other view of the self is the result of a misunderstanding, a wrong identification, or ignorance that is due to a delusion at the roots of our experience. This delusion causes an apparent identification of ourselves with all that is limited. And that delusion is dispelled through effecting a disidentification of our innermost self from what is finite and transient. Chanak is therefore given instructions in the real self-knowledge. If he can understand this central teaching on disidentifying his sense of self from all that is limited, he will automatically understand the true meaning of renunciation. For renunciation, in the ultimate sense, is disidentification. It has much to do with ceasing to identify ourselves with false views and ideas of selfhood. These are replaced by the true understanding that one's own true nature is the divine self, which is pure consciousness and nothing else. So what does this teaching mean in practice? It is that our delusion or deliverance depends on the state of our mind and the type of thoughts we entertain. Thoughts based on narrow self-interest impede our awakening to the higher self-knowledge, whereas a peaceful state of mind that appreciates the oneness of all life and desires the freedom of enlightenment will gain purity of insight, leading to fulfillment. Thus, we find in these teachings a call to reduce unnecessary and wasteful mental activity and to make the mind still and peaceful. This subtle yet fundamental renunciation is referred to in the Bhagavad Gita when it says, "No one becomes a yogi who has not renounced thoughts." This does not mean suppressing all thinking, which is impossible and unnecessary. What is needed is the inner power to control and direct our thoughts, so that the mind functions according to our choice, to my choice, and not as an independent force. And this power develops through our meditation practice. We learn how to reduce the wasteful and purposeless mental activity and replace it with thoughts based on the higher wisdom. Thoughts which open a way to the discovery of our true identity. How can we be sure that this kind of inner change will bring us lasting fulfillment? Surely, this narrowing of interest and this control of thought will make our life drab, poor, and colorless, all for the sake of a result that may actually never come about. Through reflection and meditation, we'll come to appreciate that the promise of the peace, freedom, and joy of our true being is reliable and self-revealing. At the heart of human nature, there is untaintable perfection, and we'll never be happy or free until we have brought this perfection to light within our own mind. This affirmation of perfection is not just an idea or belief to make us feel better. It is the ultimate fact about our nature, here, now, and always. This is the basic self-recognition that prompted Chanak to declare, I've got it before, but you may remember. There we are. Wonderful am I. In spite of the body and its properties, I'm one. I go nowhere I come from nowhere. I abide in myself, pervading the whole universe. One of the ideas here is that in spite of the outer appearances, in spite of physical conditions, there is a deeper dimension of self that transcends what is physical, transcends time, and transcends space also. Some may think that this view of the intrinsic perfection of human nature is too good to be true. Surely it is just something imagined. Isn't it wildly utopian and naive? Friends, in response, we can say that this view of human nature may be out of the range of the pleasure-loving, extrovertive mind, or a mind that is satisfied with its present range of experience and the mental powers already operative within it. But this is not the only creative expression available to us. Our mind can also be rendered pure and peaceful. And this condition, far from diminishing or destabilizing our life, will enhance and expand our consciousness through the awakening of our latent faculty for higher wisdom. And through this inner development, we'll realize that this deeper self-identity is available to us. Again, we may say, well, doesn't this quest go against nature? The answer is no, because it recognizes our highest nature and how that too craves for expression and realization. What is truly unnatural is that we should live our entire life without an inkling that the kingdom of heaven is awaiting discovery within us. Therefore, our quest is to effect the falling away of veils of illusion or the dissolving of clouds that hide the inner sun or that hide an inner sun. Ashtavakra's teachings give assurance of a wider horizon within reach. More than this, this quest is not intended to create something in the personality that it does not already possess. Its aim is to reveal the natural stage of the self. The path of yoga is like a step ladder leading upwards, but it doesn't lead upwards to an unnatural position. It is more like the case of a man who has fallen into a deep pit. The ladder of yoga is made available to save him from his predicament. He climbs that ladder step by step, escaping from the pit, and finds himself back on level ground. Now he can walk freely and has no need to carry the ladder about with him. Similarly, the teachings are not intended to uplift us to a new and artificial level of consciousness. They are to awaken us to the fundamental freedom that ever prevails at the core of our being. Another important phase of this teaching is that one's real self is the source of happiness. And several verses of the Ashtavakra Gita end with the statement, be happy or live in bliss. For example, my child, study and discussion of different philosophies will not establish thee in the self. Forget all and be happy. Society tends to convince us that we must achieve and acquire in order to be happy, and that happiness depends on our possessions and on our connection with other people. But to think in this way is to be under a delusion. Real, lasting happiness comes from quietening the mental activity and allowing the deeper aspect of our being to reveal itself. The natural bliss is present at the center of our being, and it is our essence. To the ordinary way of thinking, every desire we cherish is a promise of happiness. But so often, the acquired joy is mingled with anxiety, fear of loss, and never satisfies us for long. If desire led to true satisfaction, we would have stopped desiring long ago. On the other hand, the sages who are free from desire testify to a true happiness that springs from their own being and will never fade. The same point is made again and again in the Ashtavakra Gita. Anxiety produces misery. Anxiety produces misery and nothing else. He who realizes this relinquishes all desires and is calm and happy. Desire constitutes the only bondage. To be freed from it is liberation. By cultivating indifference to worldly objects, one obtains the bliss of realization. We may argue that such an attitude of indifference to worldly objects will foster in us an uncaring attitude to other people, or cause us to be negligent in our work. But such negligence or indifference is nowhere recommended in the non-dual teachings. The Bhagavad Gita, for example, counsels a diligent application to our duties in life and being friendly and compassionate to all beings. But we should also cultivate a spirit of inner independence. This means that we should not allow our mind to be so dependent on any particular situation or relationship that we feel it is the be-all and end-all of our life. Our consciousness should be so rooted in the deepest spiritual values that we never feel all is lost if things go wrong. On the positive side, we accept that there is much to be learned from any seemingly adverse situation, so that we are willing to regard hindrances as possible blessings in disguise. If we cultivate equanimity and avoid both exuberance and despondency, then we'll be able to meet any change or loss with tranquil endurance and recover our sense of life's higher purpose. Here one could object that this attitude only suits people with retiring natures who actually don't want to face the challenge of life and who are not really in tune with what life is all about. But in fact, the true spirit of renunciation results from a shrewd and comprehensive understanding of the range and limitations of material life, and the realization that true fulfillment does not lie in the world of outer experiment and adventure. The attraction to the higher teachings comes to a person after long experience in the world and through learning from that experience. The Ashtavakra Gita points to a stage when we really have learned that eternal happiness is not to be found in the things that change. At this stage, detachment or renunciation becomes natural and gives great peace. Those who have finally learned that it is in the nature of objects to come into existence, to change, and finally to pass away, they easily find rest through detachment and are freed from suffering. As we mentioned before, liberation in the non-dual tradition is inseparable from self-knowledge, knowing ourselves to be beyond the limitations of personality as pure consciousness, infinite and eternal. Therefore, we need to give some attention to the deep philosophical question, what am I? And this involves a special kind of analysis of our own being, relating particularly to the events within our mind. We have to be alert to what actually is going on in our conscious experience at any given moment. The aim of this introvertiveness is not to analyze the passing thoughts. It is to detect whether anything in our being does not pass away, but remains present and constant amid the flux and flow of thought. We may at first judge that there is only movement and change, as thoughts make their appearance, stay a while, and inevitably pass on, making way for new thoughts. Even while the thought stays, whether momentarily or as a constant preoccupation, it is undergoing changes all the while, is never quite the same from second to second. Yet the mere fact that the sequence of our mental events is known points to a knowing principle, a knower that is unchanging and is more fundamental to our nature than the thoughts that appear before it. This continuous awareness to which the changing thoughts appear is itself independent of the process of change. We may argue that this so-called awareness, which never appears as a thought, is surely not worth investigating, and that what really matters are the thoughts themselves, not the awareness that witnesses them. Yet there is no justification for devaluing or dismissing this innermost principle of awareness, the knower of our thoughts, the knower of knowing. For it is the light that reveals thoughts, and the power that makes thinking possible and meaningful. To realize the true nature of this interior light is to know ourselves to be infinite consciousness. This philosophical dimension of yoga comes through in many of the verses of the Ashtavakra Gita, where the innermost reality of our being is referred to as pure intelligence, pure knowledge, and again, consciousness. For example, one of the opening verses suggests this self-knowledge is the secret of happiness. If detaching yourself from your sense of identity with the body, you remain at rest in intelligence, yours will be spontaneous bliss, eternal peace, and liberation from the imagined bondage. Notice that the sage does not say, concentrate on that unchanging intelligence, but rest in it. Rest in it. The witness consciousness can never be an object of concentration, because it is never an object, either of thought or sense. But being the ultimate subject, it abides as the inner light and support of thought. Therefore, it is always with us, underlying, so to say, our mind, and we can rest in it. And we can do this by withdrawing our attention and identification from the passing states of the mind. Our internal resting place, our only stable refuge, is therefore not other than the same consciousness that we identified as the knower of our thoughts, the knower of knowing, and this is our true self. So this pure witnessing intelligence is the only element in experience that remains the same in the past, present, and future. This is the real self, our real being. It cannot be known objectively, but can be realized as one's true nature. This knowledge brings ultimate satisfaction and the conviction of conscious immortality. This is not immortality of the body, but the recognition of the immortality of the innermost self, here, now, and always. This is expressed in the following verse. Let the body last until the end of the world, or perish today. Nothing can be added to or subtracted from thyself, which is pure knowledge. The purpose of the higher yoga is to help us create the inner condition of peace and self-inquiry, which will awaken our power of higher vision and knowledge. Many verses in this classic suggest to us the universality of our own innermost consciousness. An image that recurs is that of an infinite ocean. I am the limitless ocean in which, on the rising of the wind of the mind, the worlds are produced as waves on the sea. I am the limitless ocean in which, on the rising of the wind of the mind, the worlds are produced as waves on the sea. This verse teaches us that in reality there is only the self, and that it is all pervasive. Just as waves, bubbles and foam are not other than water, so too everything in experience is a phenomenal manifestation of the one great reality. Ashtavakra speaks of the rising of the wind of the mind. It is this mental activity that gives rise to our experience of the world, our state of peace or of disturbance, determines how we experience life. As one of the verses expresses it, he who thinks himself to be free is free. He who thinks himself to be bound is bound. True is the saying, as a man thinks, so he becomes. All our knowledge of the world comes to us through one single organ of experience, our own apparently individualized mind. When the mind becomes tranquil, a very different perception of reality comes to light. Another verse takes this teaching a step further. In me, the infinite ocean, arises the imagined universe, tranquil and attributeless. Myself abides forever. This verse suggests calm acceptance of a world of appearances based on the realization that all phenomena, all that appears, cannot touch the self. It could not appear if the self were not present. The appearances, the movements, names and forms depend on the great self that reveals them. The great self depends on nothing and is self-revealed. It is a realization that cannot be described in words. But the words of the illumined sages can equip us with key images and concepts that will help us to probe more deeply into that same impersonal self, which is our own true being. This great teaching comes alive as we proceed with our meditation practice and our life of higher purpose. We may call this endeavor the yoga of self-knowledge. But such a course is not viewed as an unending quest. It is intended to lead to a definite result in our own lifetime. But friends, even to say this can be misleading, for the idea of making efforts towards an achievement is not the last word of the non-dual wisdom. When the self is realized, all talk of achievement is inappropriate. From the standpoint of the higher knowledge, the goal of enlightenment, which is the great goal of life itself, is realized as ever achieved. In the words of Sri Shankara, the chief exponent of the non-dual philosophy, the self is ever pure, ever free, ever enlightened. Therefore, enlightenment is the very nature of the self. Teachings which urge us to do something, to strive, to make efforts, have an important role to play, while we still feel we are separate and distinct individuals, and while we identify with our thoughts, words, and actions. We need teachings that rouse us from our inertia and apathy and can deliver us from sorrow. The ideas transmitted through the classics appeal to our higher nature and weaken the hold of the strong ideas that obscure our clarity of vision. As these clouds of mental agitation and confusion are thinned, a new and subtler insight begins to make its appeal. This is the realization that what we are seeking is ever with us and underlies our experience here, now. No worldly analogy can meet the situation of the seeker striving to achieve what is ever achieved. But I think we all have had the experience of thinking we've lost something, only to discover that it was close at hand all the time. And the yoga classics give the example of the lost necklace. A woman becomes distressed because she has convinced herself that she has lost her necklace. She looks again and again in the jewelry box, then searches all around in the house, but nowhere is the necklace to be seen. And then, glancing in a mirror, as if by accident, she catches sight of the glinting jewels. At once she realizes that she had been wearing the necklace all the time, but through a kind of mental oversight, she had lost touch with this fact. The necklace was never lost. There was never a need to search for it. All that was necessary was to put a stop to the stream of wrong ideas about the lost necklace and come back to herself. As regards realization of the true self, the example of the seemingly lost necklace isn't to suggest that our awakening to the higher wisdom is brought about by an effortless turn in our thoughts, without having prepared inwardly for such a realization. For the misconceptions we cherish about our own nature usually cling to the mind even after we have intellectually grasped the point that what we are seeking is ever achieved. Nonetheless, the illustration of the necklace and the doctrine of the ever-achieved self, when reflected on in serenity, can prepare us for our awakening to self-knowledge. Here is a verse that makes this point. I may have it on screen. There is no spiritual peace for the ignorant, because they desire and seek it in the external world. The wise realize it internally as ever achieved and are at peace. Friends, the realization taught by Ashtavakra is not a case of realizing I was in bondage, now I'm free. All ideas of individuality, bondage, suffering, and even the path of spiritual effort is overcome the effort to overcome suffering and attain freedom. All such ideas are evaporate and are forgotten in the higher light of realization. Just as one's dreams, however vivid, are forgotten and seen as illusion when the sleeper wakes up. All that remains is eternal freedom, perfect fulfillment, transcending limitations. It is direct experience of non-dual reality, as Ashtavakra reminds us. In the ocean of the world, one alone was, is, and will be. There is neither bondage nor liberation in thee. Live in perfect happiness and in the consciousness that all is achieved. Our work is to prepare our mind for this supreme realization. And that work is the ultimate use of our mental faculties on the path to their liberating wisdom. Thank you.